You're
Try it.
It's beautiful.
I'm probably gonna be close.
No, just try it. It actually tastes more like lemon than it does chile.
Well, okay, are there any questions about the readings?
Do you? I do.
I'm
No.
scared. Is it bad? No.
No, it's so good. I'm telling you.
Where's the question today?
They didn't today.
I like your lipstick.
Oftentimes they do, though.
That's pretty good.
But here's a question that I asked them that I want to ask you guys too.
Have you tried it?
Yes.
You want to think?
Are you gonna listen to our
So
proposition?
here's a question I asked them that I want to ask you.
Is
Okay. So in the textbook, Trachtenberg makes a comment. He says Florence, the city of Florence that we saw in the video last week in Italy, Florence, Italy, in that time of the Renaissance, became the new Athens. Not Athens, Athens. So I wanted to throw that back to you guys to see what you thought that might mean. What does that mean? Florence became the new Athens.
Would it be like the place to be at the time? Like an mountain kind of?
Well, yeah, but what kinds of things? I mean, if we think back to ancient Greece, the city of Athens, the city-state of Athens, what kinds of things were going on there during the golden age of Greece?
Was that what the capital? Somebody, Constantine, the capital of Greece, didn't he? Am I thinking right?
You said that was Rome.
Oh, right. Oh,
Rome.
okay.
That was Rome.
Well, yeah.
It was, I guess, very artistic.
It was very artistic, exactly. Anything else? Well, here's another way of thinking about it. How did the ancient Greeks regard the value of the individual and the human being? Did they think, they're not worth anything, they're not worthy. We're all about God and penance and religion and all that. No, quite the opposite. They did think that the individual had incredible worth and value. And that's one of the great characteristics of Greek society that we today even try to emulate. So what was really going on? And in the video there were comments made, references made to these central Italian towns like Florence, like Siena, like Pisa, as being city-states. City-states. So here's some things to think about when we think about the significance of the Renaissance. We learned in the video that the Renaissance was sort of a time of this rise of this new group of people called the middle class. And we have to understand, we take the middle class for granted today. But prior to the end of the Middle Ages, the beginning of the Renaissance, in Europe, there were two classes. The upper class, royalty, the church, bishops, cardinals, all that. And the lower class. People who were just really happy to have a place to somebody who's in the upper class. Meat? Meat. Fact.
Oh, so, what?
Well, okay, so having wealth, money, property, whatever. And on the other hand, the lower class, what types of things or traits would we associate with them?
Working.
Working, we hope, but maybe not.
Small houses.
Small houses, if you had a house at all. No property, no value.
Poor life?
Poor life.
Hunting.
Huh?
Hunting.
Hunting.
God, that's my kind.
Well, I think we would all agree there's a great disparity between the upper class and the lower class. And the line was clearly drawn. So toward the end of the Middle Ages, the beginning of the Renaissance, this new group of people called the middle class had come into being. A New Deal. So who are the middle class? Today, when we say the middle class, what do we usually associate with the middle class? Oh, come on.
They had the one house, two cars.
Yeah, I mean, you can think about the demographics, define them in demographics. They're usually going to own some property.
Yeah.
They're going to have some possessions. They're going to have a job, maybe be professionals even. But unlike the lower class or the upper class, they're probably going to be self-made. Now, let me clarify that. Today, we think about the upper class in terms of, well, like Donald Trump. Donald Trump, definitely an upper class person, billionaire, president-elect. But we're in a society that enables what we call upward social mobility. You know, we're able to move in this country from the middle class if we work hard enough and accrue enough to the upper class, and certainly we're able to move to the lower class. That's pretty easy. Just go broke. But in the Middle Ages and toward the Renaissance, there was not that transfer between and among the classes. I mean, how did you get to be in the upper class in the Middle Ages?
Royalty?
Hmm?
You had to marry into royalty?
Yeah, but royalty usually married royalty. So your point's well made. You had to be born into it. If you were in the upper class, you were born into the upper class. You didn't get a job, work hard, build a tower, and end up in the upper class. It just didn't happen. So I guess what I'm trying to get at is that at the dawn of the Renaissance, this new entity that was beginning to exert its influence, called the middle class, was really gaining some ground and some foothold. It was a new phenomenon. In Western society, there'd never been this thing called the middle class before. So when we saw the video last week, who were these middle class people? Well, you remember the guilds? They talked about guilds. And you've probably heard of guilds before. They generally are associated with craftsmen, tradespeople. And that's essentially how their middle class society was set up. And we heard about Mason guilds, we heard about the banking guild, the lawyers and solicitors, the metal workers guild. And in that building known as the what is it in Florence? In Siena, it's the Palazzo Pubblico. I can't think of the name now in Florence. But it's that big town hall they have there. And in the arches around the top of that building are all of the coats of arms of all of the guilds that represented the want to be governed. If we're dealing with people who have, well, sort of pulled themselves up by the bootstraps, been very entrepreneurial, gone out, started businesses, looked for opportunities to create wealth and make money, and are more or less self-made people, who do you think they want governing them? Hmm?
Not like royalty?
Not like royalty, no, themselves. If we can do all this by ourselves, we don't need royalty. We can rule ourselves. And that was the basis of the communal governments. And that was what was really new and different that was happening during this period, this rise of the middle class, and what their aspirations were, what their dreams and what their hopes were, what they wanted their society to become. And they were wielding the power to make that happen. And, as you said, it was very artistic. It was a great time to be an artist because there was lots of money and peace and prosperity. So there were people who would fund you to do drawings or to do paintings or to do sculpture or whatever. And they did. And we saw in the video that the guilds would compete for one another to get the best artists to decorate their chapels within Santa Croce and all of that stuff. So it was basically a free market system. And in our free market system, what's one of the elements of our free market system that generates progress and technology? Well, we learned in the video that the guilds would compete with one another to see who could have the best artists and the best arts. So competition. Competition. Okay, so here's the analogy I used in the earlier class. All of you guys have those things, right, that you're doing this with all the time? Okay. So how many generations of those new and improved things have you all seen in your lifetime? I mean, it used to be when you got a cell phone, like 10 years ago or 5 years ago, when people like me were just starting to get cell phones, which by the way, I haven't bought into that yet. I'm still not doing that.
You get the walkie-talkies in, like that.
What are those, the
A
big
beep phone?
ones, the beepers?
Yeah.
The same
That was probably like 10 years ago.
Mobile phones. No, that was longer ago than that. Actually, you'd be amazed. What they first called what you guys are using as smartphones now, they used to call them palm top technology. And that was around in the early 90s. They had developed the technology by the early 90s to make smartphones. They weren't selling them as smartphones. You could buy a palm top computer, though, which was essentially what a smartphone is now. But they've been around a while. But no, 5, 10 years ago when old people were maybe getting cell phones for the first time, not me, but old people. And the argument would be, well, my family wants me to get a cell phone. I travel some and I travel alone, and if I'm out and if I break down, I can get help with a cell phone. Yeah. But now, I was thinking about that the other day. If you don't have a cell phone today, you feel left out. I mean, you're like alone. Unless you're me. You don't miss it, not having a cell phone. So I go back to the original question. How many generations of phone have you guys seen since you've been having phones? How many new models have come out? How many new things can you do now with phones that you couldn't do with the first one you had? A few, huh?
Just a few things.
Just a few things. Okay, so what do you think was the vehicle that was making all that happen? I mean, why did we keep getting new models of cell phones? Why did new generations come out of cell phones?
Competition.
Yeah, competition. Companies wanting you to give them your money so that they could sell you phones. So the competition was driving greater and greater strides in technology. Well, the same thing was happening in the Renaissance with the artists. This guy, Brunelleschi, that we began to hear about in the video, who is the father of the Renaissance, if you will, among other things, he did sort of codify or define this thing called linear perspective. Now, what do you know about linear perspective?
And it's at one point, kind of.
Well, it can mean at one point, it can mean at 2 points. Yeah. But what linear perspective has to do with in terms of drawing is the ability to draw things the way the human eye sees those things. Because you know, the human eye distorts reality. I mean, it's all about how the anatomy of the human eye works. You all probably know about that, how we have these eye things that have lenses that are curved surfaces, and they let light in, and it distorts the image and even turns it upside down on the back wall of the eye. And then there's this thing called the retina that plugs into the back, and it sort of translates that image to your brain. So your brain figures out what it is you're looking at and what you're seeing. But it's really not the way things look. Because humans see in what we call a cone of vision. In other words, if you stand up, put your two hands in front of your face, stare at them, and keep staring straight ahead, and then begin to move them. Keep staring straight ahead. At some point, you're not going to be able to see your right and left hand anymore. And that begins to determine your cone of vision horizontally. You can do the same thing vertically. Stare ahead, and all of a sudden your hands would disappear. And that begins to define your entire scope of vision. And it's a cone. It's not straight lines. So it begins to help me understand why intellectually I know that each one of these chairs in this room are the same size, built the same way, basically identical. But when I stand here and look at that number 7 chair, it looks bigger than the ones that are all the way back at the end of the room. But intellectually, I know they're the same size. But that's a good example of the way the human eye distorts space and reality. So through the Middle Ages, we had artists, we had Gisli-Berdus, and later on we had Giotto, who was beginning to play around with this idea of three-dimensional space depiction. But he didn't quite get it right, but Brunelleschi did. So I like to use the analogy of kids. You all have kids? You probably don't have kids. I've got kids. My kids are old. They're old kids. Old kids. They're older than you are.
How many kids do you have?
I have 3.
Did you ever do the fire last night?
I did not. I had a meeting. I'm going to do the fire tonight. I had to go to a meeting last night. Didn't get home till 10 o'clock.
Fire Christmas Day.
Okay, so when my kids were young, they went to school. They had art class. They'd come home. Oh, Daddy, look, I drew a picture of the house. And it looked something like that. And I'd look at it and I'd say, oh, that's a great picture. I think you need a trophy. No, I didn't say that. I said, you know, we can maybe play around with that picture and do some interesting things. They said, really? I said, yeah. So I got pencil out and, you know, started doing stuff like this. And they looked at that and their eyes huge. Wow, what's that? I said, well, you did a 2-dimensional drawing. You did lines sideways and up and down. The 3rd dimension and they're not the same. So then I would give them a challenge. I'd say, well, okay, we know the house sits on the street, and there's a sidewalk out in front of the house. Why don't you add the sidewalk to your drawing? And I'll never forget, my oldest son, he sat there and he looked at that. He thought about it, and then he did this. There it is. There's the sidewalk. And he thought it out. He knew it was at the front door. He knew it was in front of the front door. So he did the best he could do intellectually. And he was a bright kid, but he was only 5 or 6 years old. So I said, well, wait a minute, let's do this. And I started doing this. And I said, and there's a curve out there. And a gutter. And he began to look at that and was like, God, it's huge. So, you know, we have to learn how to represent things the way we see them, not the way we think about them. And that's what Brunelleschi was able to do. The competition among the guilds for better and better artwork and artists drove Brunelleschi to develop the code, if you will, for 2-point, but first 1-point perspective. So these two illustrations next to my wonderful house drawing illustrate what the difference between 1-point and 2-point perspective is. And 2-point's a little bit easier to understand, so we'll look at that first. If I were to draw a cube and rotate it so that I saw both sides of it, then clearly all of the depth lines in this direction are culminating in a vanishing point on the right side. Whereas all of the depth lines on the left are culminating in a second vanishing point, which is what this was all about. You know, I'm really locating my vanishing points when I do that in the cone of my human vision. So for architecture people, it's very important that you all understand this idea of how we think about objects in space versus how we really see them. Because it's what generated this huge revolution in Renaissance art and architecture. And they're all tied together. So what Brunelleschi did, instead of working out 2-point perspective first, he worked out what we call 1-point perspective. And it's literally represented by this drawing. So let me sort of get rid of this drawing and start over again to illustrate the point. If I draw a rectangle and call that my picture plane, that becomes the closest point of the drawing to me. And all of my depth lines are going to travel back in space to 1 point. That 1 point can be in the middle, can be to the right, can be to the left, it can be up here, it can be down here. So let's take the example of a room or a box that we're going to look into. And let's put our vanishing point there. Okay, so we can geometrically construct the exact locations in space for any object from the picture plane back based on what Brunelleschi did. But for a quick sketch, all I need to do is take all of my depth lines in this space and run them through that single vanishing point. Oops, screwed that up a little bit. So, you know, I can do that, and gee, I've created the depth looking into this box or this room. But likewise, I can calculate and geometrically locate any objects that might be in that space by using the same principle. I don't think I did that right. I think we need to go this way a little bit more. So for example, I could draw this box within the box and line up all of the depth lines in the perspective with the same vanishing point. So by doing that, I'm really beginning to clearly define sees them. But the irony is, when we draw the way we see things, we distort the image. Because truly, if this is a rectangular cube of a room, then this dimension is the same as that dimension. But when I draw it a whole lot smaller, because that's the way the human eye sees it. Things get smaller as they get farther away from us. And that was the genius of what Brunelleschi was able to do, was to come up with the mathematical and geometric processes to accurately calculate where those things are based on how we see them. It's essentially the same thing that your eye doctor does with optics when they are fitting you with glasses or contacts. So it was really high tech. Now, you all have heard the term virtual reality, right?
Yeah, that's a new thing
Not that new. But today,
Hey, yeah, well, it's
Well,
like putting on the mask and the
okay, all right. So anybody who has ever played a video game understands virtual reality. I mean, you see these people sitting in front of that screen. They've got these controls, and you can hear their heart pounding as they're doing this, and you can see their pulse bumping up and down, and they're sweating, and it looks like they're going to have a heart attack doing whatever they're doing because they're into it. You know, whether it's beating somebody over the head with an arm that they've torn off of them, or a zombie or something. Who knows what it is? But you're literally there. You're doing it. I mean, we didn't have anything like that when I was a kid. Hell, we had to go out in the back alley and pick a fight if we wanted to get into something like that. It was the reality, not the virtual reality. But for the Renaissance, this technology represented a similar thing. It became a virtual reality for people in a way that they had never experienced paintings and drawings before. And the first applications were religious paintings. And we saw that in the video. We saw in the Bardi Chapel or somebody's chapel in Santa Croce where they had the scene of the death of St. Francis painted on a fresco. And there was poor old St. Francis, who everybody loved, laying on his deathbed. And there were all these people, his fellow Franciscans, standing around. Oh, and you could see the grief on their faces. The level of the artwork had gotten to the point where they could make them look really real. And they could really make them look like they were upset and crying and full of grief. So that what the result of that was, when worshipers came into that chapel, they had that religious experience too, virtually, through the painting. And it was incredibly powerful. It was like magic. It was like my son, their eyes got huge. How do you do that? It was just phenomenal. So, the level of technology, while we may think that it is very primitive by today's standards, it represented the same type of leap, in effect, that video games and all of this new virtual reality does for us today. Or for some of us today. Some of us still, don't do that or do that or anything like that. But what I'm going to try to help you guys understand is that these developments in technology, this linear perspective, what it represents, along with some of the things that Brunelleschi did in terms of his travels to Rome and studies, began to define what Renaissance architecture was about, how it was different than the Romanesque, or even Roman architecture, or Greek architecture, certainly Gothic architecture. But hopefully, as we go through the rest of the lecture today, you'll see that part of the essence of what is Renaissance, what makes Renaissance architecture, is very much tied up with the idea of perspective. Because what perspective does is it creates a sense of order and rationale thinking of where things are supposed to be. But it's also very static. Now, what do I mean by that? Okay, you all have got cell phones, right? You got cameras on your cell phones? See, it used to be a cell phone was just a phone. Then all of a sudden, oh, you got a camera on your phone? And then all of a sudden you can Google, take me to the nearest McDonald's. There was a TV commercial on one day last week. I don't know what it was. I was doing something, the TV was on and I heard it. But the comment was, well, that's as useless as a paper map. And I thought, useless as a paper map? I got a whole drawer full of paper maps. I use paper maps. You all use paper maps? Google, take me home. Okay. I mean, that's new. That's different. Okay, so you got a cell phone. It's got a camera, right? You open that thing up, and you hold it up, and you see what the picture's going to be, right? You move it over, it automatically adjusts for where the picture's going next. You move it over, and up, and down, and the image that you see through that viewfinder is continually changing. It's readjusting to its new position or its new perspective. Okay, so here's what I'm getting at. If we take either one of these drawings, because of the principles under which they're drawn, they are meant to be seen from one specific place. One location makes this perspective work. One location, one point of view makes this perspective work with the vanishing points. The minute I change my position, the drawing's no longer valid. It doesn't work. Everything's off. Unlike your cell phone camera, this drawing cannot adjust from you moving from a position of viewing it. Which means that if you want to change that view, you got to erase the drawing and start all over again. Bummer. So what does that mean? That means that this great new technology that they came up with, this linear perspective, meant that you were fixed in a static location in order to understand and appreciate that view, that space, that architecture. And that, too, is a very strong characteristic of Renaissance architecture. It's fixed, meant to be viewed, meant to be experienced in a static, non-moving, very rational, very orderly way. Okay. Are there any questions about this? Does this make any sense at all to you? Okay. Hopefully. We'll see when exam 3 comes along. All right, so let's look at the PowerPoint and begin to look at some images, and hopefully it will begin to make more sense to you. All right. So this is the official first Renaissance PowerPoint. And when we look at some of the text on the first page, you know, we've already talked about a lot of this stuff. However, we did not talk about this first thing. And it was mentioned in the video last week, the humanists, who were the people who basically were the scholars in the Renaissance who were doing the research, wanting to find out everything about what classical Rome did, and maybe even Greece as well. But their name is based on a philosophy that dominated the period, known as humanism. So humanism was practiced and believed in by these people called humanists. But what was humanism? Well, the best way to define it is to look at the root word, human. What does that mean? Well, it means humans. It means human beings, people. So, by its very name, it indicates that, gee, all of a sudden, like the ancient Greeks, the worth of the individual, it's all about us humans, was very important. But it wasn't all blatantly that, because we're going to find out that through the Renaissance, there's an attempt to reconcile the religious beliefs of the Catholic Church with these sort of Greco-Roman traits of human beings rather than God. Because, remember, in that greatest video you will ever watch regarding architecture, cathedral, one of the things we were told early on was that if you lived in the Middle Ages, you were taught that your whole life was part of God's plan. Every event in your life, good, bad, ugly, indifferent, was all part of God's plan. And we were just sort of here to get there, right? Well, gee, when the Renaissance came along and there was this new group of middle-class people who were sort of self-sufficient and wanted to be governed by their own people, well, you think they're going to take that idea of manifest destiny or predestination literally? Why, no, we're in charge of things now. So it was very different. Okay, Renaissance vision, we talked a little bit about that. But it is true, historians know now, that every phase of the Middle Ages really had a mini Renaissance occurring. There were advances all along the way. The Renaissance people really were full of themselves, and according to their point of view, they were the ones who all of a sudden woke up one day and said, this is the Renaissance, we're the greatest, we have all these things. But in truth, it was a gradual buildup over a long period of time. So, Renaissance vision. Okay, new style characteristics. Well, we just mentioned a few without even looking at any examples. And it's that idea of rationale, order, rigidity, static space, non-moving. But Trachtenberg also talks about the way Brunelleschi used classical elements. Now, what do we mean by classical elements? Columns, lintels, arches even. And the way he put those together, Trachtenberg describes using terms like lightness and clarity. Well, what does that mean? Well, we're going to look at some examples. But the point is that it's very different than the way the Romans used arches, very different than the way the Greeks used columns, very different than the way the Romanesque people, or Romanesque style, I should say, used those same elements. Okay. And of course, we've talked a lot about the technological advances. What was it? Intel? No. Linear perspective. Okay. So, this guy, Filippo Brunelleschi, the father of the Renaissance, really noted for developing and codifying linear perspective. And for figuring out how to build the dome over the Florence Cathedral. And of course, we learned that that was quite a feat in the video, and the dome itself on the Duomo represents the start of the Renaissance. It's not like they planned it that way, it was sort of a hindsight thing. But the reality is that until that point, there had never been, since the Roman Empire, such a vast project taken on by any group of people as the building of that dome. Now, the other thing that we learned from that video was, can you imagine in today's world, a city or a country or somebody undertaking a major building project, the biggest building in the town, and building it and working on it for 50 years, never knowing how you're going to put a roof on it, not knowing this miraculous fellow, Brunelleschi, came along and came up with the idea, ultimately, on how to build it. And it got done. This next bullet, the Ospedali degli Innocenti, which translated into American is basically Orphans Hospital. And it has significance on multiple levels, the first of which we're interested in, it was the first building that was designed and built by Brunelleschi where he utilized this new style he had developed, which we now call the Renaissance style. On the other hand, though, this idea of having a public facility for the care and nurturing of orphans, I mean, prior to this time, if you were an orphan, you were a waif, you were in the street. That was it. I mean, there were no public facilities to take care of homeless children or whatever. So your survival rate was not very good. But it's significant that the people of Florence would build such a facility. It showed how the humanists valued all human life. So that was very significant as well. The Pozzi Chapel is another example of an early Renaissance work we're going to look at, done by Brunelleschi. But we begin with the Church of San Lorenzo. And there are a number of reasons why we do that. So we will start by looking at a plan of the complex known as San Lorenzo. And I think it's pretty easy to tell that yes, there's a church here. There's a main central nave, side aisles, a transept, an altar. But there are other things going on here as well, like this cloister or quadrangle area, which we're going to look at in a minute, and other things that happened later on in the Renaissance and into the transitional period between Renaissance and Baroque, known as the Mannerist period, such as this number 4 here and this number 3. They define a library addition to this complex that was designed by a fellow named Michelangelo, who is considered a late Renaissance into what we call the Mannerist period, which was foreshadowing Baroque, which is the next major style. So Michelangelo gets involved later on with this library and also this chapel right here known as the Medici Chapel. So the Medici is the key operative here because this church and this church complex was the neighborhood / family church of that family known as the Medici. Who were those banking people? Who were the wealthiest of all of the guilds people in Renaissance Florence? So this was their place. So they had the best because they could pay for it. All right, and there it is. What a pretty church. Isn't that magnificent? But in reality, it is just another example of a European church that hadn't been finished yet. They're just not finished. Because, well, there was never an acceptable design put forth for the facade. And if you go to Florence, which I hope you do someday, you can go to Michelangelo's house. It is there in Florence, and it's open for tours. And in that house is a scale model of a design that he did for the facade of this building, which has never been implemented. As a matter of fact, I believe there's a drawing of it right there. Now, if we were to turn around from where we are standing, what our perspective is of this photograph of this church, there would be a street running to our right. This is a vendor here. And there would be a street immediately behind us. And where those two streets meet to our right rear would be the palace of the Medici. It was literally catty corner across the street from this church. So to give you an idea of perspective and scale, things were pretty close together. Okay, so there's the facade, there's the elevation, and here we have a view into that cloister area, which in plan is this space here, to the left of the church. And in it, we can see our first example of Renaissance architecture. And what do we see? Well, we see a bunch of arches, we see some columns, but yet Trachtenberg describes the way they're used as having a certain lightness. Okay, well, what does that mean? Well, if you think about the last style that used rounded arches and colonnettes, it was the Romanesque. And remember, the characteristics of Romanesque were thick, heavy, articulated walls. Well, all of a sudden we have these sort of buoyant, bouncing, light-looking arches springing across these relatively skinny little columns. So it's like, this is wimp Romanesque. Or maybe it has more to do with the rationale of where things are placed. Look at the symmetry. Look at the order. Do you think that it's an accident that this column on the second level is directly above the column on the first? And that this one's directly above that one, and that one, and that one, and that one, and that one? And if any one of those were off or out of place, you would know it. It would show up. And of course, there's also things we're going to talk about that have to do with the base to the height and those overall proportions that were used by Brunelleschi. But very simple looking overall. Very geometric, very rational, very orderly, very clear where everything needs to go. Well, this is one of my favorite photographs to illustrate the sense of space that Renaissance architecture is trying to create. And here we have a view inside the church of San Lorenzo, looking from one side aisle across the main nave to the other side aisles in a series of niches that have little altars in them. And everything knows where it's supposed to be. Strongly symmetrical. If we draw a line down the middle, we got this column, we got that column, this column, that column. We even have a grid on the floor that reinforces that linear perspective that we're seeing, and all the lines converge to that most important spot where the tabernacle would be. Now, there was one major screw up here. I don't know who put this cross there, but that ought to be taken out. Either that or they ought to put another one over here. But at any rate, there's this very strong sense of ordered space and a very definite perspective view from which we are to view it. So, in terms of spatial organization, this really clearly defines order in the cosmos, which is what the Renaissance was trying to achieve. Now, the other visual characteristic that you should notice here is Brunelleschi's use of this gray-colored stone with a white stucco wall background. That is a combination that he developed as part of his Renaissance style as well. And there's a name for it. It's called Pietra Serena, whatever that means. But you will notice on all of his early buildings, well, all of his buildings, that's what he does. Uses that combination. Okay, so then we move to the dome of the Florence Cathedral, which is different from the Church of San Lorenzo. And there it is, with its lantern. And notice all the people. Have you been there?
I don't remember.
You don't remember?
I
You
think
would,
something like
you would church and up into the drum and into that double-shelled stairway space that goes round and round and ultimately to the top. And it's pretty cool. It's a lot of steps, but it's worth it. Very cool. So the big gig with this dome was multifold, but it has to do with Brunelleschi's solution of how to construct this dome. Okay. The real key, as we learned in the video, was his use of brickwork that had a herringbone or zigzag pattern. Because what that did is it added strength to the dome wall and allowed it to be self-supporting as it was being built. So it was kind of like working like a corbelled arch. Because remember, on the inner shell, there was an inner shell and an outer shell. And the inner shell is, well, they both may be herringbone brick, I don't remember, but definitely, well, I don't remember now. But what it allowed them to do, remember, they're building a curvilinear wall that is also domical. So in the past, what would have been done to achieve that would have been some sort of scaffolding and some sort of centering or formwork. And part of the issue was, in Europe at that time, there wasn't enough timber to even dream of doing something like that from the floor up. And as we learned in the video, it would have been so heavy, it wouldn't have been able to support itself. So one of the other things that Brunelleschi did, which was ingenious, for his workmen to build those self-supporting walls, he